The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beyond the flight deck of USS Constellation, its surface catching the first light of dawn like scattered diamonds. At 0530 hours, Lieutenant Sarah Chun walked the carrier's flight deck, her boots silent against the non-skid surface as she moved between the rows of FA-18 Super Hornets. The morning air carried the familiar scent of jet fuel and salt spray, mixed with the underlying tension that preceded every training exercise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Around her, the flight deck buzzed with controlled chaos. Ordnance crews loaded practice missiles onto gleaming aircraft while plane captains performed final inspections. The newer Super Hornets dominated the deck space, their pristine gray paint, skeins reflecting the carrier's floodlights. Squadron patches and pilot names adorned each aircraft in bold, colorful displays of unit pride and individual achievement. Then there was her aircraft, parked at the furthest edge of the flight deck. Almost hidden behind a fuel truck sat an older FA-18C Hornet that looked like it belonged to a different generation. The paint was faded from countless carrier landings and salt spray exposure. Scuff marks covered the landing gear doors, and the squadron markings were barely visible through years of wear. Someone had removed her name placard entirely, leaving only 4 small holes in the fuselage where it once mounted. Sarah approached her aircraft without ceremony. Over the past 4 months aboard Constellation, she had learned to move through the carrier's spaces like a ghost, invisible among the elite pilots of Strike Fighter Squadron 194, the Red Lightnings. The other aviators clustered around the newer Super Hornets, their conversations filled with the easy confidence of pilots who had never been told they didn't belong. She had arrived aboard Constellation fresh from completing her FA-18 qualification at Naval Air Station Lemoore. What should have been the culmination of years of training felt more like banishment. While her classmates received assignments to frontline squadrons, preparing for combat deployments, Sarah found herself assigned to a training unit, supposedly gaining valuable experience in advanced tactical development. The reality was markedly different. A yellow sticky note fluttered against her aircraft's canopy rail, secured with a piece of duct tape. Someone had written on it in black marker, "Observation only, no tactical participation." She didn't remove it. She had learned not to give them additional reasons to question her presence. Opening her kneeboard, Sarah flipped through pages of handwritten calculations and tactical analyses. While other pilots relied on computer-generated threat assessments and digital mission planning systems, she had been studying engagement geometry and energy management principles in painstaking detail. No one had requested this analysis, but if she was going to be relegated to watching from the sidelines, she intended to understand every aspect of what she observed. The ship's announcing system crackled to life, echoing across the flight deck. "Flight quarters, flight quarters. All hands man your flight quarters stations." The familiar call sent ripples of activity throughout the deck as final preparations began for the morning's training exercise. From the Air Operations Center, Commander Jake Thompson's voice boomed across the flight deck through the speakers. "Mission brief for Operation Steel Wave commences in 15 minutes. All participating aircrew report to Ready Room 3 immediately." Sarah watched as pilots streamed toward the island superstructure, their flight suits bearing the patches and insignia that marked them as members of the carrier's Prover squadrons. The Red Lightnings led the procession, followed by the pilots. From VFA-143, the Pukin Dogs, and VFA-37, the Bulls. These were the Navy's finest, handpicked for advanced tactical training and eventual deployment to the world's most challenging theaters. She followed at a distance, her own plain flight suit marking her as something different, something apart from the brotherhood of combat aviators. The ready room filled quickly with the controlled energy that preceded every major exercise. Pilots settled into leather chairs arranged in rows facing a large tactical display screen. The air conditioning hummed quietly, barely managing to counter the heat generated by 40-plus bodies in a confined space. Sarah took her customary position against the back wall, clipboard pressed against her thigh, waiting for assignments that would inevitably place her on the periphery. Commander Thompson stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. A 20-year veteran with combat experience over Iraq and Afghanistan, Thompson had earned his reputation through exceptional flying and tactical innovation. His squadron patches told the story of a career spent at the tip of the spear. "Gentlemen," he began, then paused as his eyes found Sarah at the back of the room. "And lady, today's exercise represents the culmination of 6 weeks of advanced tactical training. We'll be conducting simulated strike operations against a heavily defended target complex, while facing opposition from some of the most skilled pilots in the Navy." The tactical display illuminated, showing a three-dimensional representation of the exercise area. Colored icons represented various aircraft types and defensive positions, spread across hundreds of square miles of Pacific airspace. Red Force will consist of 12 A-18 Super Hornets divided into 3 strike packages. Your mission is to penetrate a sophisticated air defense network and achieve simulated weapons release on designated targets. Thompson clicked his laser pointer, highlighting specific areas on the display. Blue Force opposition will be provided by 6 A-18 Hornets from the Top Gun School at Fallon, flown by some of the Navy's most experienced adversary pilots. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the room. Facing Top Gun instructors was considered the ultimate test for naval aviators. These pilots had flown combat missions, survived advanced training programs that eliminated 90% of applicants, and spent years perfecting the art of aerial warfare. Lieutenant Commander Mark Stevenson, leader of the Red Lightnings, raised his hand. "Sir, what's the threat assessment for the adversary aircraft? Should we expect standard defensive tactics or something more sophisticated?" Thompson's expression grew serious. "Intelligence indicates these pilots have been developing new engagement techniques based on lessons learned from recent international exercises. They've been specifically studying our tactics and developing countermeasures. Don't expect this to be routine." Sarah made notes on her kneeboard, her handwriting steady despite the familiar exclusion from tactical planning. Around her, pilots discussed formation assignments and engagement strategies with the natural camaraderie of those who trusted each other with their lives. "Observer aircraft parameters," Thompson continued, barely glancing toward Sarah's position. "Single Hornet, maintaining safe separation in Corridor 7. Mission is passive collection of engagement data for post-exercise analysis. Maintain radio silence except for emergency situations." Lieutenant Alex Morrison, one of the younger pilots from VFA 143, turned slightly in his chair and whispered something to his wingmen. Both pilots suppressed grins, their amusement clearly directed at the observer mission that everyone understood to be a courtesy assignment rather than meaningful participation. The briefing continued with detailed discussions of ingress routes, defensive formations, and engagement rules. Sarah listened carefully, noting discrepancies between the official intelligence assessment and patterns she had observed during previous exercises. The Top Gun pilots had been rotating through Constellation for 2 months, and she had been watching their techniques evolve with each engagement. They weren't simply flying better than expected. They were adapting their tactics in real time, developing new approaches that exploited weaknesses in standard Navy procedures. She had documented 17 distinct tactical innovations in her private notes, but no one had asked for her observations. After the briefing, pilots clustered around the mission planning computers, fine-tuning their navigation systems and weapon employment profiles. Sarah approached one of the terminals, hoping to review the predicted threat positions, but Lieutenant Morrison smoothly moved to block her access. "Observer doesn't need mission planning access," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're just along for the ride, right?" She nodded and stepped away, returning to her position against the wall. Through the ready room's windows, she could see the flight deck where ordnance crews were completing their final preparations. In 2 hours, she would be airborne, relegated to a safe corridor while the most important training her squadron had conducted in months unfolded around her. Walking back to her aircraft, Sarah passed groups of pilots and maintainers engaged in animated discussions about the upcoming exercise. Fragments of conversation drifted across the deck, speculation about adversary tactics, concerns about new threat systems, and the competitive banter that masked genuine anxiety about facing some of the Navy's best pilots. She found Chief Petty Officer Robert Martinez conducting a final inspection of her Hornet. Martinez was a 20-year veteran who had maintained carrier aircraft through multiple deployments. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked hydraulic connections and electrical systems. "Morning, Lieutenant," he said without looking up from his checklist. "She's ready to fly, but I still don't understand why they've got you running observation missions in a perfectly good fighter." Sarah appreciated Martinez's directness. Most of the enlisted personnel treated her with professional courtesy, but Martinez was one of the few who seemed genuinely puzzled by her assignment, rather than dismissive of her capabilities. "Orders are orders, Chief," she replied, beginning her own pre-flight inspection. "Sometimes you serve where you're needed most." Martinez paused in his work, studying her expression. "Ma'am, I've been working on carrier aircraft for 2 decades. I've seen a lot of pilots come and go, and I can tell the difference between someone who belongs in a cockpit and someone who's just along for the ride." He gestured toward her aircraft's faded exterior. "This bird might not look like much, but she's got good bones. And from what I can see, so do you." The simple statement of confidence meant more to Sarah than any official recognition she might have received. She completed her inspection in silence, checking control surfaces and engine intakes with the thoroughness that had become second nature. As she prepared to climb into her cockpit, Sarah noticed Commander Thompson watching her from across the flight deck. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, his expression unreadable. She wondered if he questioned her assignment as much as she did, or if he simply accepted the bureaucratic decisions that had placed her in this position. The flight deck around her hummed with final preparations. Yellow-shirted aircraft directors positioned the Super Hornets for launch, while red-shirted ordnance personnel completed their safety checks. The controlled chaos of carrier operations unfolded with the precision of a ballet, performed at the edge of disaster. Sarah strapped into her ejection seat and began her pre-start checklist. The familiar routine of switch positions and system checks provided a momentary escape from the frustration of being sidelined. Inside her cockpit, she was still a naval aviator, regardless of how others chose to define her role. As she waited for the signal to start engines, Sarah reviewed her notes one final time. Today would mark her 15th observation flight, and she had accumulated more data about the Top Gun pilot's tactics than anyone else in the strike group. The patterns were clear to her. These aviators weren't simply executing standard adversary procedures. They were innovating, creating new approaches that challenged fundamental assumptions about air-to-air combat, but knowledge without the ability to act remained merely academic exercise. She would watch today's engagement unfold from her assigned corridor, collecting data that might eventually find its way into official reports. While the pilots she could have helped struggled against techniques they didn't understand, the weight of unused potential settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden. 4 months of watching, 4 months of learning, 4 months of being told her observations were interesting but not essential. Today's exercise would be different only in scale, not in her role as a passive observer of events. She was uniquely qualified to influence. The signal came to start engines, and Sarah pressed the starter button for her single General Electric F404 turbofan. The engine spooled up with a rising whine that vibrated through the airframe, joining the symphony of power that surrounded her on the carrier's flight deck. In 30 minutes, she would be airborne for what promised to be the most challenging exercise her squadron had faced. 12 of the Navy's most promising young pilots would test themselves against 6 of the service's most experienced adversary aviators. The outcome would influence training programs, tactical development, and potentially the careers of everyone involved. And she would watch it happen from the sidelines, invisible in her observer role, perfectly positioned to see everything and powerless to change anything. At least that's what everyone expected. Sarah had other plans. The catapult shuttle slammed into position beneath Sarah's Hornet with a metallic clang that reverberated through the airframe. Steam rose from the catapult track as the deck crew made final connections, preparing to launch her into the Pacific sky. Through her heads-up display, she could see the other aircraft already airborne, their formation lights disappearing into the morning haze as they proceeded to their assigned stations. "Cat 2, you're hooked up and ready," came the voice of the catapult officer through her headset. "Stand by for the launch sequence." Sarah ran through her final checks, her hands moving across the cockpit controls with practiced precision. Engine parameters were nominal, control surfaces responded correctly, and her navigation system showed the exact coordinates of Corridor 7, where she would spend the next hour and a half observing an exercise she understood better than most of its participants. The catapult fired with the familiar violence that never became routine. 4 Gs of acceleration compressed her into her seat as the Hornet rocketed from 0 to 150 knots in under 3 seconds. The carrier's deck fell away beneath her as she climbed into the clear Pacific morning, alone in her obsolete fighter while the real war games began without her. Leveling off at her assigned altitude of 25,000 feet, Sarah activated her passive sensor systems and opened her kneeboard to a fresh page of calculations. What she was about to do violated no regulations, broke no rules, and would appear in no official reports. For the past 4 months, she had been conducting the most comprehensive analysis of advanced aerial tactics ever assembled by a single pilot, and today would provide the most complete data set yet. Her targeting pod, officially configured for observation only, possessed capabilities that few people fully understood. While it couldn't provide target illumination or weapons guidance in its current mode, it could detect and track multiple aircraft simultaneously, recording their precise movements, energy states, and tactical positioning. More importantly, Sarah had learned to interpret this data in ways that revealed the underlying mathematics of aerial combat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Steel Wave Alpha Flight. Proceed to Point Bravo and establish combat air patrol, came the voice of Commander Thompson from his position as mission commander. The first wave of Super Hornets was moving into position, their confident chatter filling the tactical frequency as they discussed their approach to the target area. Sarah switched her display to show the tactical picture building around her. 12 blue icons represented the attacking force, spread across 3 separate ingress routes, designed to overwhelm the defenders through coordinated timing and multiple threat vectors. On paper, it was a textbook approach that maximized the advantages of superior numbers and advanced technology. But Sarah knew something the mission planners didn't. Over the past 2 months, she had observed the Top Gun pilots develop specific countermeasures for exactly this type of coordinated assault. They called it distributed engagement, and it turned conventional tactical wisdom on its head. Instead of concentrating their defensive efforts at a single choke point, the adversary pilots would spread across a much wider area, using superior individual skills to defeat attacking aircraft in separate, isolated engagements. The technique required exceptional pilot ability and perfect coordination, but when executed properly, it could defeat numerically superior forces by preventing them from bringing their numbers to bear effectively. Unknown contacts bearing 045. Range 60 miles, announced Lieutenant Stevenson from his position, leading the Red Lightning Formation. Count 6, type unknown, altitude Angels 20. The Top Gun pilots had arrived, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she watched the tactical display update with 6 red icons approaching from the northeast. These weren't random training targets. These were some of the most skilled adversary pilots in the world, each with thousands of hours of experience and proven records in both training and combat environments. Commander Rick Harrison led the adversary force from his position in a specially modified FA-18C similar to Sarah's aircraft. Harrison was a legend in naval aviation circles, with combat tours over Iraq and Afghanistan, followed by 3 years as a Top Gun instructor. His wingman, Lieutenant Commander Dana Walsh, was equally formidable, having earned her reputation through a combination of natural ability and relentless dedication to tactical perfection. Sarah had studied both pilots extensively during their previous visits to Constellation. Harrison favored complex vertical maneuvers that exploited altitude advantages, while Walsh specialized in close-range engagements where superior reflexes and aircraft handling could overcome technological disadvantages. Together, they formed the most effective adversary team she had ever observed. Steel Wave Alpha, contact bearing 030, range 45 miles in closing, Stevenson reported. Request permission to engage. Alpha flight cleared to engage, Thompson replied. Execute plan. Delta, Bravo, and Charlie flights, maintain schedule and proceed to your assigned targets. Sarah opened her notebook to page 17, where she had documented the specific vulnerabilities of Plan Delta during previous exercises. The formation called for the lead flight to engage the adversary, while the remaining aircraft proceeded to their target areas. It was aggressive and decisive, but it also divided the attacking force at exactly the moment when the Top Gun pilots were most dangerous. Through her targeting pod, she watched the geometry of the engagement develop with mathematical precision. The Red Lightnings were approaching in a standard 4-ship diamond formation, their radar signatures bright and obvious against the morning sky. Meanwhile, the adversary aircraft had spread into a loose line abreast formation that would be invisible to conventional tactical analysis, but was perfectly designed to exploit the weaknesses in Plan Delta. Contact, called Lieutenant Morrison from his position as Stevenson's wingman. Multiple bandits, bearing 035, range 20 miles and closing fast. What Morrison couldn't see, but Sarah could track through her passive sensors, was that the adversary formation was already beginning to split. Harrison and Walsh were maintaining their obvious approach vector, drawing attention and radar locks from the attacking aircraft. Meanwhile, the other 4 Top Gun pilots were using a technique Sarah had privately termed ghost displacement, using terrain masking and careful energy management to disappear from conventional sensors while repositioning for flanking attacks. Steel Wave Alpha engaging, Stevenson announced, his voice carrying the confidence of a pilot who had never been beaten in training exercises. Fox 3, he called, indicating simulated missile launches against the apparent lead adversary aircraft. Sarah made rapid calculations on her kneeboard, tracking the engagement geometry as it developed. Stevenson had fired at what appeared to be Commander Harrison's aircraft, but her sensor data indicated something impossible. The target was actually Lieutenant Commander Walsh, who had somehow managed to exchange positions with her flight leader during the approach without being detected by conventional radar. The deception was brilliant in its simplicity. Both pilots flew identical aircraft with nearly identical radar signatures. By carefully coordinating their maneuvers during the initial approach, they had created a targeting illusion that would cause the attacking aircraft to fire at the wrong targets, wasting their initial missile advantage against decoys while the real threats remained unengaged. Good tone, Morrison called out, believing he had achieved a successful missile lock against a second adversary aircraft, Fox 3 on the trailing Bandit. But Sarah's sensors told a different story. Morrison's target was actually one of the ghost-displaced aircraft, which had used a complex energy management technique to present a false radar signature while remaining outside the engagement envelope. The simulated missile would miss by over a mile, leaving Morrison committed to an attack run against an opponent who was perfectly positioned to counterattack. Splash 1 Bandit, Stevenson announced confidently, continuing engagement. Negative. Steel Wave Alpha, came Harrison's voice over the adversary's frequency, calm and professional. No kill. Your missile targeted a decoy signature. Recommend you check your 6 o'clock. The confusion in Stevenson's voice was immediate and obvious. Say again, adversary. I had a solid lock and good missile parameters. Check your sensors. Alpha leader, Walsh's voice joined the conversation. You might be surprised by what you find. Through her targeting pod, Sarah watched the tactical situation collapse with terrifying speed. The Red Lightnings had fired their initial missiles at phantom targets, revealing their positions while failing to reduce the actual threat. Meanwhile, the 4 ghost-displaced adversary aircraft had completed their flanking maneuver and were now approaching the attacking formation from multiple vectors simultaneously. Multiple bandits, multiple directions. Morrison's voice carried the first hint of panic. I'm showing contacts at my 3, 6, and 9 o'clock positions. How is that possible? Sarah knew exactly how it was possible. The Top Gun pilots were executing a coordinated defensive technique that used individual excellence to create tactical multiplication. Each adversary pilot was engaging targets from a different vector, preventing the attacking aircraft from supporting each other effectively while ensuring that every defensive move created new vulnerabilities. Steel Wave Alpha, you have multiple threats inbound. Thompson's voice cut through the tactical frequency from his position as overall mission commander. Recommend immediate defensive action, but it was already too late. The Red Lightnings found themselves surrounded by adversary aircraft that seemed to anticipate every defensive maneuver. Within 90 seconds of initial contact, all 4 Super Hornets had been declared destroyed by the exercise controllers, their pilots facing the humiliation of being defeated by half their number in aircraft that was supposedly inferior to their own. Alpha Flight, return to base, Thompson ordered, his voice carefully controlled. Bravo Flight, continue mission as planned. Sarah made detailed notes as the second wave of attacking aircraft approached the same airspace where their predecessors had been systematically destroyed. The pilots of VFA 143 had listened to the Alpha Flight engagement, but they appeared to believe they could succeed where the Red Lightnings had failed. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Young led Bravo Flight with the confidence of a pilot who had graduated at the top of her class and never lost a training engagement. Her formation approached the target area using a different route and attack profile, but Sarah could already see the fundamental flaw in their strategy. They were still thinking conventionally, still assuming that superior technology and numbers would overcome individual skill and tactical innovation. They hadn't understood that the Top Gun pilots weren't simply flying better than expected. They had reinvented the rules of aerial engagement entirely. Bravo Flight, contact bearing 270, range 35 miles, Young reported. Count shows 4 bandits in defensive formation. Request permission to engage. Bravo Flight cleared to engage, Thompson replied. Execute Plan Charlie. Maintain mutual support and watch for flanking attempts. Plan Charlie was more conservative than Plan Delta, calling for the attacking aircraft to remain concentrated while approaching the target area. In theory, it should have prevented the isolation tactics that had defeated the Red Lightnings. In practice, Sarah knew it would simply provide the adversary pilots with a different set of tactical opportunities. Through her sensors, she watched Commander Harrison reposition his formation to counter the new threat. The adversary aircraft spread into what appeared to be a standard defensive line, but Sarah's analysis revealed it to be something far more sophisticated. Each pilot was positioned to provide overlapping defensive coverage while maintaining the ability to execute individual offensive actions. The technique required extraordinary pilot skill and perfect communication. But when properly executed, it created a defensive network that could absorb attacks from multiple directions while maintaining offensive capability against every attacking aircraft simultaneously. Contact multiple bandits bearing 275, called Lieutenant Kevin Rodriguez from his position as Young's wingman. They're spread across a wide front. Recommend we concentrate on the lead elements. Roger, concentrate fire on the northern formation. Young ordered. All aircraft weapons are tight until we achieve positive identification. But Sarah knew the identification process itself was being manipulated by the adversary pilots. They were using a combination of electronic warfare techniques and tactical positioning to present false signatures that would cause the attacking aircraft to waste their missiles against targets that didn't exist while failing to engage the actual threats. Fox 3, Young announced, launching simulated missiles against what her sensors identified as the primary threat aircraft. Good tone on the formation leader. Fox 3 on the southern element, Rodriguez added, firing at what appeared to be a second adversary aircraft, attempting to flank their formation. Sarah made rapid calculations, tracking the missile flight paths against the actual positions of the adversary aircraft. Both pilots had fired at ghost signatures created through coordinated maneuvering and electronic deception. Their missiles would impact empty airspace while the real threats remained fully capable and perfectly positioned for counterattack. Splash 2 bandits, Young announced confidently, continuing to target the area. Negative, Bravo leader. Commander Harrison's voice remained maddeningly calm. No kills achieved. Your missiles targeted false positives. Check your defensive posture. The tactical display on Sarah's screen showed the truth that the attacking pilots couldn't see. While they had been engaging phantom targets, the adversary aircraft had used their misdirection to achieve perfect positioning for a coordinated assault. 6 Top Gun pilots were now positioned around the 4 attacking Super Hornets like wolves, surrounding sheep. Multiple threats, multiple vectors. Rodriguez's voice carried real alarm. I'm showing bandits at every compass point. How did they get behind us? Maintain formation integrity, Young ordered, but her voice betrayed the confidence she was trying to project. Execute defensive wheel, clockwise rotation. The defensive wheel was a standard maneuver designed to maintain mutual support while defending against attacks from multiple directions. Against conventional opponents, it might have been effective. Against the Top Gun pilots, it simply provided them with predictable target motion that simplified their attack calculations. Steal. Wave Bravo, you are taking defensive fire from multiple directions, the exercise controller announced. Bravo 2 and Bravo 4 are declared destroyed. Remaining aircraft, take immediate evasive action. Half of the second attacking formation had been eliminated within 3 minutes of initial contact. The remaining 2 Super Hornets attempted to disengage, but the adversary pilots pursued with relentless efficiency, using their superior position and energy state to prevent escape. Bravo leader going defensive, Young announced, her aircraft diving toward the ocean in a desperate attempt to break contact, requesting immediate support from Charlie Flight. Charlie Flight, negative. Thompson's voice carried the strain of watching his carefully planned exercise disintegrate. Maintain a mission schedule. Bravo Flight, continue evasive action and attempt to rejoin formation. But there would be no rejoining. The Top Gun pilots completed their systematic destruction of Bravo flight within 5 minutes, leaving 8 of 12 attacking aircraft declared destroyed before reaching their target area. The exercise was becoming a demonstration of tactical supremacy that would have profound implications for naval aviation training. Sarah closed her notebook and began a new page of calculations. The final attacking formation, Charlie Flight, was approaching the target area with full knowledge of what had happened to their predecessors. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander David Kim, was one of the most experienced pilots in the strike group, with combat experience and advanced tactical training. If anyone could find a way to defeat the Top Gun pilots, it would be Kim and his formation. But Sarah's analysis suggested that conventional tactics, no matter how skillfully executed, would not be sufficient against opponents who had transcended conventional limitations. The adversary pilots weren't simply better trained or more experienced. They had developed new approaches to aerial combat that challenged fundamental assumptions about how air-to-air engagements should be conducted. They were fighting a different war entirely, using rules that the attacking pilots didn't understand and couldn't counter without a complete revision of their tactical thinking. As Charlie's flight approached their moment of truth, Sarah realized she was witnessing something historically significant. This wasn't just a training exercise. It was a revolution in aerial warfare, conducted by 6 pilots who had figured out how to turn individual excellence into tactical multiplication, and she was the only person in position to understand exactly how they were doing it. The Combat Information Center aboard USS Constellation hummed with tense activity as radar operators tracked the unfolding disaster in the exercise area. Admiral William Hartley, commander of Carrier Strike Group 11, stood behind the central tactical display, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of multiple screens, showing the systematic destruction of his strike aircraft. "Sir, Charlie Flight is approaching the target area," reported Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Walsh, the strike group's operations officer. "They're requesting permission to modify their attack profile based on lessons learned from Alpha and Bravo flights." "Admiral." Hartley's jaw tightened as he studied the tactical picture. In 30 years of naval service, he had never witnessed such a comprehensive tactical defeat during a training exercise. 8 of his most experienced pilots had been systematically outmaneuvered by half their number in aircraft that were supposedly inferior to their own Super Hornets. "Denied," he said firmly. "Exercise parameters remain unchanged. If we modify tactics every time we encounter difficulty, we'll never learn to overcome adversity through superior training and discipline." Walsh hesitated before responding. "Sir, with respect, the adversary pilots appear to be employing techniques that weren't covered in our intelligence briefings. Perhaps we should consider, Lieutenant Commander." Hartley's voice carried the authority of absolute command. "We have the finest pilots in the world flying the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. If they can't defeat 6 adversary aircraft using established tactical doctrine, then we have a training problem, not a tactical problem." The Admiral's words reflected an institutional mindset that had dominated military thinking for decades. Superior technology, when combined with intensive training and disciplined execution, should triumph over any opposition. The idea that fundamental tactical assumptions might be flawed was simply unacceptable to leaders who had built their careers on those same assumptions. 3 decks below, Sarah monitored the command frequency from her position in Corridor 7, listening to the debate about Charlie Flight's fate. Through her targeting pod, she could see Lieutenant Commander Kim's formation approaching the same airspace where 8 pilots had already been defeated. They were flying a modified approach that showed tactical awareness and adaptability, but they were still operating within conventional frameworks that the Top Gun pilots had learned to exploit. "Steel Wave Charlie, contact bearing 315, range 40 miles, Kim reported, his voice steady despite the knowledge that his predecessors had been systematically destroyed in the same airspace. Count 6 bandits in defensive formation. Request permission to execute Plan Echo. Plan Echo was an improvised tactical approach that Kim had developed during the flight to the target area. Instead of approaching in standard formation, his 4 aircraft would spread across a wide front, using individual maneuvering to prevent the isolation tactics that had defeated the previous formations. Charlie Flight, negative on Plan Echo, came from Thompson's immediate response from his position. As mission commander, execute Plan Charlie as briefed. Maintain formation integrity and mutual support. The order reflected institutional resistance to tactical innovation that went beyond rigid adherence to doctrine. Thompson and his superiors had invested considerable time and resources in developing standardized tactical procedures. The suggestion that these procedures might be inadequate challenged not just their tactical judgment, but their professional competence. Sarah made notes on her kneeboard as she watched Kim's formation reluctantly return to standard tactical positioning. Pilot was being forced to execute a plan that had already proven ineffective against opponents who had transcended conventional limitations. It was like watching a chess master being required to use only opening moves while facing opponents who were free to employ the entire range of strategic possibilities. Control, this is Observer 7. Sarah transmitted on the designated frequency, breaking her customary radio silence. Request permission to provide tactical input based on observational data. A long pause followed before Thompson's voice crackled through her headset. Observer 7 negative. Maintain observation posture and limit communications to emergency situations only. The response was automatic, reflecting institutional prejudices that ran deeper than simple chain of command considerations. Sarah's insights were dismissed not because they lacked merit, but because they came from someone whose role had been defined as passive rather than active. The system couldn't conceive that valuable tactical intelligence might emerge from sources outside established hierarchies. Charlie Flight, contact confirmed, Kim announced. 6 bandits in defensive line formation. Initiating attack approach. Using Plan Charlie parameters. Through her sensors, Sarah watched the familiar tactical geometry develop once again. The Top Gun pilots were positioning themselves to execute the same distributed engagement technique that had proved so effective against the previous formations. Commander Harrison had refined his approach based on lessons learned from earlier engagements, while his wingman Walsh had identified new vulnerabilities in the standard attack procedures. Multiple contact splitting, reported Lieutenant Tommy Chun, Kim's wingman. Bandits are maneuvering to multiple vectors. Recommend we adjust formation to counter flanking attempts. Negative, maintain Plan Charlie formation. Thompson's voice cut across the tactical frequency. Execute standard defensive procedures. Do not deviate from established doctrine. The order forced Kim's formation to maintain tactical positioning that played directly into the adversary's strengths. They were required to present predictable targets while their opponents were free to employ innovative maneuvering that exploited every weakness in conventional approach procedures. Sarah calculated the engagement geometry as it developed, her mathematical analysis revealing the inevitable outcome with depressing clarity. Charlie's flight was approaching at the precise angle and altitude that would allow the Top Gun pilots to execute their most effective counter tactics. The attacking aircraft would be destroyed within 6 minutes of initial contact unless they were permitted to deviate from procedures that had already proven inadequate. Steel Wave Charlie engaging, Kim announced, his professionalism masking what must have been considerable frustration with the tactical constraints imposed on his formation. Fox 3 on the northern element. The missile launches followed. The same pattern that had characterized the previous engagements. Kim's formation fired at what appeared to be legitimate targets, but Sarah's sensor data revealed they were attacking carefully constructed false signatures while the real threats remained unengaged and perfectly positioned for counterattack. Good. Hits on 2 bandits, Kim reported, believing his missiles had found their marks. Continuing engagement against remaining threats. Negative kills achieved. Commander Harrison's voice remained maddeningly calm. Your weapons targeted decoy signatures. Check your defensive posture immediately. The revelation that their missiles had been wasted against phantom targets should have prompted immediate tactical reassessment. Instead, Thompson's voice crackled across the frequency with orders that reflected institutional inflexibility rather than tactical adaptation. Charlie Flight, maintain current approach. Execute secondary engagement procedures per established doctrine. Sarah watched in frustrated silence as Kim's formation attempted to comply with orders that guaranteed their destruction. The Top Gun pilots had achieved perfect positioning during the misdirected missile engagement, and they were now executing coordinated attacks that exploited every limitation of the standard defensive procedures. Multiple threats, multiple vectors. Chun's voice carried the strain of a pilot facing impossible tactical circumstances. I'm showing bandits at every compass heading. Requesting permission to break formation and execute individual evasive action. Negative, Charlie 2, Thompson replied immediately. Maintain formation integrity. Execute defensive wheel maneuver per tactical manual. The defensive wheel had already proven ineffective against the Top Gun pilot's coordinated assault techniques. Ordering its continued use demonstrated a level of institutional blindness that transcended simple tactical miscalculation. The system was literally unable to acknowledge that its fundamental assumptions might be incorrect. Steel Wave Charlie taking fire from multiple directions, the exercise controller announced. Charlie 2 and Charlie 4 are declared destroyed. Remaining aircraft continue mission as directed. Half of the final attacking formation had been eliminated, and the exercise was proceeding toward complete tactical disaster. In the Combat Information Center, Admiral Hartley stared at the tactical display with an expression that combined disbelief with growing anger. This is unacceptable, he said to no one in particular. How are 6 adversary aircraft defeating 12 of our best pilots in superior aircraft? Sir, Lieutenant Commander Walsh ventured carefully, perhaps we should consider that the adversary pilots might be employing techniques that our current tactical doctrine doesn't address adequately. Hartley turned toward her with the cold stare of a career officer whose fundamental beliefs were being challenged. Lieutenant Commander, are you suggesting that decades of tactical development and combat experience are somehow inadequate against a handful of training pilots? No, sir, Walsh replied quickly, recognizing the dangerous ground she was treading. I'm simply noting that the exercise results suggest we might benefit from tactical reassessment. The only reassessment we need, Hartley said firmly, is determining why our pilots aren't executing established procedures with sufficient discipline and precision. The Admiral's response perfectly encapsulated the institutional mindset that prevented recognition of tactical innovation. Rather than acknowledging that the adversary pilots might have developed superior approaches, he chose to believe that his own pilots were somehow failing to execute procedures that he considered fundamentally sound. Meanwhile, the final 2 aircraft of Charlie Flight were fighting for survival against opponents who seemed to anticipate every defensive maneuver. Kim had managed to survive longer than his predecessors through superior individual skill and tactical awareness, but he was still constrained by orders that prevented effective response to the threats he faced. Charlie leader going defensive, Kim announced, his aircraft diving toward the ocean in a desperate attempt to break contact. Requesting immediate tactical guidance for countering distributed engagement techniques. Charlie leader, execute standard evasion procedures, Thompson replied. Maintain course toward the secondary target area. The order to continue toward the target area while under effective attack from multiple directions demonstrated complete disconnection from tactical reality. Kim was being instructed to ignore immediate threats in favor of pursuing mission objectives that had become meaningless, given the tactical situation. "Control, this is Observer 7, Sarah transmitted, her frustration finally overriding protocol considerations. "I have tactical intelligence that could assist Charlie Flight in countering current threats. Observer 7, you are directed to maintain radio silence." Thompson's response was immediate and sharp. "Your role is observation only. Do not interfere with tactical operations." The rejection of her offer reflected institutional assumptions about where tactical knowledge could and should originate. Sarah's months of careful analysis and detailed understanding of adversary techniques were dismissed simply because her official role had been defined as passive rather than active. "Charlie Leader is declaring emergency." Kim's voice cut through the tactical frequency with desperate urgency. "I have multiple bandits in firing positions and insufficient altitude for effective evasive action. Requesting immediate support." "No support available," Thompson replied, his voice betraying the strain of watching his carefully planned exercise collapse into complete disaster. "Execute individual survival procedures." The phrase "individual survival procedures" effectively acknowledged that the exercise had devolved from coordinated tactical operation to desperate individual combat. Kim was being abandoned to face multiple highly skilled opponents without support, guidance, or effective tactical options. Through her targeting pod, Sarah watched the final engagement develop with the inevitability of a mathematical equation. Commander Harrison and Lieutenant Commander Walsh had positioned themselves to execute a coordinated attack that would eliminate the remaining attacking aircraft within minutes. Their tactical superiority was so complete that the outcome was predetermined unless fundamental assumptions about the engagement were revised. "Steel Wave Charlie Leader is declared destroyed," the exercise controller announced with professional detachment. "Exercise termination in 5 minutes. All aircraft return to base immediately." The announcement confirmed what Sarah had been predicting for the past hour. 12 of the Navy's most experienced pilots in the world's most advanced fighter aircraft had been systematically defeated by half their number in supposedly inferior aircraft. The tactical defeat was so complete that it challenged fundamental assumptions about air combat that had guided military thinking for decades. In the Combat Information Center, Admiral Hartley stared at the tactical display showing 12 blue icons marked as destroyed while 6 red adversary icons remained fully functional. The results were impossible to reconcile with his understanding of tactical reality, yet they were undeniable. "I want a complete investigation of this exercise," he announced to the assembled staff officers. "Equipment malfunctions, pilot error, inadequate preparation. Something went wrong here, and I want to know what it was." The Admiral's response reflected institutional inability to acknowledge that the adversary pilots might simply have been better. Rather than recognizing tactical innovation, he chose to assume that some form of failure or malfunction must explain results that contradicted his fundamental beliefs about air combat. Lieutenant Commander Walsh exchanged glances with the other staff officers, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. No one wanted to suggest that the Admiral's tactical assumptions might be incorrect, but the exercise results demanded some form of explanation that went beyond simple pilot error or equipment malfunction. "Sir," Walsh said carefully, "perhaps we should interview the adversary pilots to determine what techniques they employed. Understanding their approach might help us develop more effective counter-tactics." "Absolutely not," Hartley replied immediately. "We will not legitimize this result by treating it as tactically significant. Our pilots will receive additional training in standard procedures, and we will repeat this exercise until they demonstrate proper execution of established doctrine." The decision to repeat the exercise using the same failed tactics perfectly illustrated the institutional blindness that prevented learning from tactical innovation. Rather than acknowledging that new approaches might be necessary, the Admiral chose to believe that more intensive application of existing methods would somehow produced different results. As the surviving aircraft began their return to the carrier, Sarah realized she had witnessed something unprecedented in military aviation. Not just a tactical defeat, but a complete institutional failure to recognize and adapt to tactical innovation. The system's inability to acknowledge that its fundamental assumptions might be flawed had transformed a learning opportunity into a demonstration of bureaucratic rigidity. The most frustrating aspect was her own powerlessness to influence the situation. Her detailed analysis and comprehensive understanding of the adversary techniques were dismissed without consideration simply because her role had been defined as passive observation rather than active participation. But as she began her own return to the carrier, Sarah realized that the system's blindness might also represent an opportunity. If institutional leaders were unwilling to acknowledge tactical innovation, then perhaps change would have to come from sources they didn't expect and couldn't easily dismiss. The question was whether she would have the courage to challenge a system that had already demonstrated its complete unwillingness to listen to voices that didn't conform to established hierarchies. Tomorrow would bring new exercises, new opportunities for the Top Gun pilots to demonstrate their tactical superiority, and new chances for institutional leaders to ignore evidence that contradicted their fundamental beliefs. Unless someone decided to break the pattern entirely, the ready room aboard USS Constellation felt like a morgue as the defeated pilots filed in for the post-exercise debrief. 12 of the Navy's finest aviators sat in uncomfortable silence, their flight suits still damp with sweat from the stress of being systematically outmaneuvered by half their number. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across faces that bore the unmistakable expression of professionals who had been humbled by inexperience. They couldn't explain. Commander Thompson stood at the front of the room, his jaw set in a rigid line as he prepared to address what could only be described as the most comprehensive tactical defeat in recent naval aviation history. Behind him, the tactical display showed the exercise results in stark detail. 12 blue icons marked as destroyed, 6 red adversary symbols still fully operational. Sarah entered quietly and took her usual position against the back wall, her kneeboard filled with detailed notes about the tactical techniques that had dominated the exercise. She had requested permission to participate in the debrief, hoping to share her analysis of the adversary tactics, but had been told that observer personnel would receive a separate, limited briefing focused on data collection procedures. "Gentlemen," Thompson began, his voice carefully controlled, "today's exercise results are unacceptable. 12 experienced pilots in advanced aircraft were defeated by 6 adversary pilots flying older technology. This outcome reflects fundamental failures in execution, discipline, and adherence to established tactical doctrine." Lieutenant Commander Kim raised his hand slowly. As the leader of Charlie Flight and one of the few pilots to survive more than 5 minutes against the Top Gun adversaries, his tactical insights carried significant weight among his peers. "Sir, with respect, I don't believe this was a failure of execution," Kim said carefully. "The adversary pilots were employing techniques that our current tactical doctrine doesn't address. They're fighting a completely different kind of engagement than what we've been trained for." Thompson's expression hardened. "Lieutenant Commander, are you suggesting that decades of tactical development and combat-proven procedures are somehow inadequate?" "I'm suggesting that warfare evolves, sir," Kim replied, his voice gaining strength. "The adversaries weren't just flying better than expected. They were using coordinated techniques that turned our own tactical strengths against us. Every time we executed standard procedures, they were perfectly positioned to counter them." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled pilots. Lieutenant Morrison, who had been shot down in the first engagement, nodded emphatically. "Kim's right, sir. It was like they knew exactly what we were going to do before we did it. Every defensive maneuver, every formation change, they had an answer prepared." Thompson walked to the tactical display and pointed to the exercise track data. What I see here is a failure to maintain formation integrity and proper execution of defensive procedures. If you had followed established doctrine precisely. We did follow doctrine. Sir, interrupted Lieutenant Rodriguez from Bravo Flight. Every procedure, every maneuver, exactly as trained. That's what made us predictable. They used our own training against us. The room fell silent as the implications of Rodriguez's statement sank in. The suggestion that their training might actually be a liability challenged fundamental assumptions about military preparation and tactical education. That's enough, Thompson said sharply. I will not listen to excuses that blame our training for pilot performance failures. You will receive additional instruction in standard procedures, and we will repeat this exercise until you demonstrate proper execution. Sir, Kim persisted, repeating failed tactics won't produce different results. We need to understand what the adversaries are doing and develop countermeasures. Someone in this strike group must have observed their techniques closely enough to The analysis will be conducted by qualified intelligence personnel. Thompson cut him off. Pilot speculation is not helpful. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. As she realized the conversation was approaching the exact knowledge gap she could fill. Her months of detailed observation had provided her with comprehensive understanding of the adversary techniques. But the institutional resistance to acknowledging tactical innovation meant her insights would be dismissed without consideration. Lieutenant. Commander Young from Bravo Flight spoke up from her position near the front of the room. Sir, what about the observer aircraft? Lieutenant Chun was monitoring the entire exercise. Perhaps she noticed patterns that we missed while we were engaged. Thompson barely glanced toward Sarah's position. Observer personnel collect data for post-exercise analysis. They don't conduct tactical interpretation. But sir, Young continued, she's a qualified pilot with extensive training. If she observed the exercise from outside the engagement, she might have insights that, Lieutenant Commander Young, Thompson's voice carried clear warning. Observer aircraft maintain passive monitoring roles. They are not qualified to provide tactical analysis. Sarah stepped forward slightly, her decision crystallizing as she watched the institutional system dismiss valuable intelligence simply because it originated from an unauthorized source. Sir, I request permission to share observational data. That might help explain the adversary tactics. The room turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to surprise. Most of the pilots had forgotten she was present, and few had ever heard her speak during official proceedings. Request denied, Thompson replied immediately. Observer data will be reviewed through proper channels by qualified analysts. Sir, Sarah pressed, knowing she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The adversaries were using distributed engagement, techniques that exploit specific vulnerabilities in our formation procedures. I've documented 17 distinct tactical innovations that could be countered if Lieutenant Chen. Thompson's voice cut like a blade. You are ordered to remain silent. Your role is data collection, not tactical interpretation. Another word and you'll face disciplinary action. The threat hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized she was facing the defining moment of her naval career. She could accept the dismissal, continue her passive role, and watch as institutional blindness guaranteed future defeats. Or she could break protocol, share her knowledge, and face the consequences of challenging established hierarchies. Kim turned in his seat to look at her directly. Sir, if Lieutenant Chun has information that could prevent future defeats, shouldn't we at least listen to what she has to say? The decision about what information is relevant, Thompson replied coldly, is not made by junior officers who failed to execute their missions successfully. The insult struck the room like a physical blow. Kin and his fellow pilots had been systematically defeated not through lack of skill or courage, but because they had been forced to fight using tactics that their opponents had learned to exploit. Thompson's suggestion that their defeats reflected personal failure rather than institutional inadequacy revealed the depth of bureaucratic blindness that prevented adaptation. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "we're going to face these adversaries again tomorrow. If we use the same tactics, we'll get the same results. Don't our people deserve every advantage we can give them?" "Your people," Thompson replied, "deserve leadership that maintains discipline and follows established procedures, not amateur tactical speculation from unqualified personnel." Sarah felt something break inside her chest as she watched 12 defeated pilots being told that their insights were worthless and their defeats were inevitable. The system's inability to learn from failure guaranteed that future exercises would produce identical results. With good pilots being humiliated by opponents they could defeat if given proper preparation. The distributed engagement technique uses individual aircraft positioning to create tactical multiplication, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Each adversary pilot engages from a different vector, preventing mutual support while ensuring that every defensive maneuver creates new vulnerabilities. Thompson spun toward her, his face flushed with anger. "Lieutenant Chun, you are in direct violation of orders. Security, escort this officer from the briefing room immediately." "The countermeasure is asymmetric formation flying," Sarah continued, speaking rapidly as 2 master-at-arms moved toward her position. Instead of maintaining standard geometric patterns, attacking aircraft spread across unpredictable intervals that prevent the adversaries from achieving coordinated positioning. "Get her out of here," Thompson ordered. But the pilots in the room were listening intently, recognizing the tactical validity of what she was describing. The ghost displacement technique uses coordinated throttle management to create false radar signatures, Sarah said as the security personnel reached her position. 2 aircraft exchange apparent positions by matching engine outputs while physically separating. Countermeasure requires active thermal tracking instead of relying on radar identification. "Lieutenant Chun, you are under arrest for insubordination," Thompson announced as the master-at-arms took her arms. "You will be confined to quarters pending disciplinary proceedings." As they led her toward the exit, Kim stood up from his chair. "Sir, everything she just described matches exactly what we experienced during the exercise. If she understands their techniques, we need to hear what she has to say." "Sit down, Lieutenant Commander," Thompson ordered. "This briefing is concluded. All personnel will report for additional training in standard tactical procedures at 0800 tomorrow." But the damage was done. Sarah's brief tactical exposition had provided the defeated pilots with the first coherent explanation for their systematic defeats. Her insights offered hope that future engagements might produce different results if conventional tactics were abandoned in favor of innovative approaches. As the security personnel escorted her from the ready room, Sarah caught sight of several pilots already discussing her tactical observations in quiet, urgent conversations. The institutional system had succeeded in silencing her voice, but the ideas themselves had taken root among the people who mattered most. The pilots who would face the adversaries again tomorrow. Lieutenant Commander Young approached the master-at-arms, escorting Sarah toward the exit. "Chief, I need to speak with Lieutenant Chun about some technical data before she's confined." The senior enlisted man hesitated, looking between Young's confident expression and Thompson's angry glare from across the room. "Ma'am, I have orders to escort her directly to quarters." "Understood, Chief," Young replied smoothly. "I'll walk with you. Just need to clarify some sensor readings from today's exercise." As they walked through the carrier's corridors toward the enlisted quarters, Young spoke quietly but urgently. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most career-ending. Probably both." "The techniques work," Sarah replied simply. "The adversaries are proving it every time they fly." Someone had to say it. "Thompson's going to crucify you for insubordination," Young warned. but you gave us something to work with. Kim and I are going to test your asymmetric formation theory during tomorrow's exercise. You'll need to modify your energy management procedures too, Sarah said. Quickly, knowing their time was limited. The adversaries use vertical maneuvering to control engagement geometry. Stay low and fast, use terrain masking, and never commit to predictable attack profiles. They reached the quarters deck, where the master-at-arms would ensure Sarah remained confined until her disciplinary hearing. Young paused at the hatch, her expression serious but determined. "Whatever happens to you officially," she said quietly, "you've given us the tools to fight back. That means something." As the hatch closed behind her, Sarah realized that her career as a passive observer was effectively over. She had chosen action over safety, truth over protocol, and the welfare of her fellow pilots over her own professional survival. Tomorrow would bring new exercises, new opportunities for the adversaries to demonstrate their tactical superiority, and new chances for institutional leaders to ignore evidence that contradicted their fundamental beliefs. But it would also bring pilots who understood that warfare evolves, that tactical innovation trumps bureaucratic rigidity, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in the sky, but in the moments when someone decides their voice deserves to be heard. The catalyst moment had passed. The consequences were just beginning. The confined quarters aboard USS Constellation felt smaller with each passing hour as Sarah waited for what she assumed would be the end of her naval aviation career. Through the small porthole, she could see the pre-dawn darkness giving way to another Pacific morning. And she knew that somewhere above the flight deck, maintenance crews were preparing aircraft for the day's exercises. Her arrest for insubordination had sent shockwaves through the strike group that extended far beyond the immediate participants in yesterday's disaster. Word of her tactical insights had spread through the carrier's informal communication networks, reaching pilots, intelligence officers, and even senior enlisted personnel who understood that conventional wisdom had failed catastrophically. A sharp knock interrupted her solitary thoughts. Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Santos, the carrier's senior enlisted advisor, entered with a breakfast tray and an expression that suggested official business rather than routine meal delivery. "Morning, Lieutenant," Santos said, setting the tray on the small desk. "Hope you slept well, because you're about to have some very interesting visitors, Master Chief," Sarah asked, surprised by the informality of his approach. Santos glanced toward the hatch, ensuring they weren't overheard, then spoke quietly but urgently. "Captain Morrison wants to see you in his quarters in 30 minutes. Unofficially, and word is that Admiral Hartley is asking questions about yesterday's exercise that nobody seems able to answer." Captain James Morrison commanded USS Constellation and held ultimate responsibility for the operational readiness of its embarked air wing. His involvement in what should have been a routine disciplinary matter suggested that Sarah's breach of protocol had created ripples extending to the highest levels of command. "Did the Master Chief say what this was about?" Sarah asked. "Not directly," Santos replied, "but Lieutenant Commander Young and Lieutenant Commander Kim submitted formal requests to test new tactical procedures during today's exercise. Requests that specifically referenced insights from Observer 7. Captain Morrison wants to understand what happened in that briefing room." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The idea that her tactical analysis might actually be considered for operational testing seemed impossible given yesterday's harsh rejection. But the comprehensive nature of the defeat had apparently forced even senior leaders to reconsider their initial dismissal of unconventional insights. "Master Chief, am I still under arrest?" Santos smiled grimly. "That depends on how this morning's conversation goes. But between you and me, half the aircrew on this boat are talking about your tactical theories. When that many pilots are interested in what you have to say, senior leadership tends to pay attention." 30 minutes later, Sarah found herself standing at attention outside Captain Morrison's quarters. her service uniform pressed to regulation perfection despite her confinement. The Marine sentry announced her arrival, and Morrison's voice called for her to enter. The captain's quarters reflected the personality of a career naval officer who had commanded ships in combat and understood that tactical innovation often emerged from unexpected sources. Charts covered one wall, showing the Pacific Theater with detailed notations about current operations and training areas. A coffee service sat on the small conference table, suggesting this would be a discussion rather than a disciplinary proceeding. "Sit down, Lieutenant," Morrison said, gesturing toward one of the chairs. "Coffee?" "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, accepting the cup while trying to read his expression for hints about her fate. Morrison settled into the opposite chair and studied her face with the careful attention of a commander evaluating personnel under unusual circumstances. "Lieutenant Chun, yesterday you committed a serious breach of protocol that under normal circumstances would result in court-martial proceedings. You directly disobeyed orders, disrupted an official briefing, and shared information outside your authorized scope of responsibility." Sarah braced herself for the inevitable consequences. "Yes, sir, I understand. However," Morrison continued, "the tactical intelligence you provided appears to be accurate and potentially valuable. Lieutenant Commander Kim and Lieutenant Commander Young have submitted detailed analyses that support your observations about adversary techniques. They're requesting permission to test your proposed countermeasures during today's exercise." The statement hung in the air like a reprieve from an execution that had seemed inevitable. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and disbelief that her insights might actually be considered worthy of operational testing. "Sir, I believe the techniques can be countered effectively if our pilots understand the underlying principles," she said. "Carefully, the adversaries aren't using superior technology. They're using superior tactics that exploit predictable elements in our standard procedures." Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. "Explain the distributed engagement technique in detail. I want to understand exactly how 6 pilots defeated 12 of our best aircrew." Sarah opened her mental notebook, drawing on months of careful observation and analysis. "Sir, conventional air-to-air tactics assume that numerical superiority provides tactical advantage. More aircraft means more firepower, more sensor coverage, and more defensive capability. The distributed engagement technique turns that assumption into a vulnerability." She paused to organize her thoughts, knowing this might be her only opportunity to present a comprehensive analysis. Instead of concentrating their defensive efforts at a single point, the adversaries spread across a wide area and engage attacking aircraft individually. Each adversary pilot positions himself to face only 1 or 2 opponents at a time, while the attacking formation finds itself unable to provide mutual support because their opponents are spread across multiple vectors. Morrison made notes on a pad as she spoke. "Continue." "The key is coordination without concentration," Sarah explained. "Each adversary pilot maintains communication with his teammates while operating independently. When an attacking formation approaches, they don't mass to meet the threat. Instead, they position themselves so that every attacking aircraft faces isolation from its wingman." "And the countermeasure?" "Asymmetric formation flying," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Instead of maintaining standard geometric patterns that the adversaries can predict and exploit, attacking aircraft spread across irregular intervals and altitudes. This prevents the adversaries from achieving coordinated positioning while maintaining enough proximity for mutual support." Morrison set down his pen and studied her face. "Lieutenant, how did you develop this analysis?" "Your official role was passive observation." "Sir, I've been studying adversary pilots for 4 months. Every exercise, every engagement, every tactical innovation. I documented patterns that emerged over time and analyzed the mathematical principles underlying their success." "Without authorization?" "Yes, sir. but the knowledge exists regardless of whether it was officially requested. Morrison smiled slightly. At her response, Lieutenant Commander Young made essentially the same argument when she requested permission to test your theories. She pointed out that tactical innovation has historically emerged from sources that weren't necessarily authorized to conduct tactical development. The captain stood and walked to his chart wall, studying the exercise area boundaries marked in red ink. Today's exercise will test whether your analysis is correct. Lieutenant Commander Kim will lead a formation using your asymmetric flying techniques against the same adversary pilots who defeated 12 aircraft yesterday. Sarah felt her breath catch. The opportunity to prove her theories under operational conditions was beyond anything she had dared hope for. However, Morrison continued, there's a condition. You'll be flying as Kim's wingman. The statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. After months of passive observation, she was being offered the chance to participate actively in proving her own tactical theories. Sir, I'm still under disciplinary action for insubordination. The disciplinary action is suspended pending the outcome of today's exercise, Morrison replied. If your tactics prove effective, the charges will be dropped. If they fail, you'll face court-martial for providing false tactical intelligence. The stakes couldn't have been clearer. Sarah's career, reputation, and freedom all depended on whether her theoretical analysis could translate into practical success against opponents who had proven their tactical superiority repeatedly. Sir, I accept those terms, she said without hesitation. Morrison returned to his chair and leaned forward with the intensity of a commander whose decisions carried life and death consequences. Lieutenant, understand what you're agreeing to. You'll be flying against 6 of the most skilled pilots in naval aviation, using experimental tactics that have never been tested operationally. If you're wrong about their effectiveness, you'll not only destroy your own career, but potentially undermine confidence in tactical innovation throughout the Navy. Sir, the tactics will work, Sarah replied with quiet confidence. I've run the scenarios hundreds of times. The mathematical principles are sound. Mathematics is one thing, Morrison observed. Combat maneuvering against pilots who've spent years perfecting their skills is something entirely different. Yes, sir, but they've been perfecting their skills against opponents who use predictable tactics. Today they'll face approaches they've never encountered before. Morrison studied her expression for long moments, evaluating the confidence behind her words. Finally, he stood and extended his hand. Lieutenant Chun, you'll report to Lieutenant Commander Kim for tactical briefing in 1 hour. Today you'll have the opportunity to prove that observation and analysis can triumph over established doctrine and superior experience. As Sarah shook his hand, she realized that everything had changed. Her months of silent observation were about to be transformed into active participation in proving that tactical innovation could emerge from unexpected sources. Walking back through the carrier's corridors toward the ready room, she felt the weight of impending demonstration. In 3 hours, she would be airborne alongside pilots who had suffered systematic defeat, using theories she had developed through patient observation, facing opponents who had never been beaten by conventional tactics. The opportunity was everything she had worked toward, but it also represented a test that could validate or destroy not just her own career, but the principle that tactical innovation should be valued regardless of its source. Master Chief Santos was waiting outside the ready room when she arrived. How did it go, Lieutenant? I'm flying today, Master Chief, she replied, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Santos grinned broadly. Outstanding. The aircrew have been talking about nothing else since yesterday. They want to see if your theories work as well in practice as they do on paper. What if they don't? Then you'll go down fighting instead of watching from the sidelines, Santos replied. And sometimes that's the only choice that matters. As Sarah entered the ready room to begin preparations for the most important flight of her career, she knew that Santos was right. Win or lose, she would finally have the chance to prove that excellence could emerge from observation, that innovation could challenge established doctrine, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who refused to accept limitations others tried to place on them. The demonstration was about to begin. The tactical briefing room buzzed with unprecedented energy as Lieutenant Commander Kim spread detailed charts across the conference table. For the first time in months, the assembled pilots displayed genuine enthusiasm, rather than the resigned acceptance that had characterized their previous encounters with the Top Gun. Adversaries. Sarah stood beside Kim as he outlined the asymmetric formation tactics she had developed, her months of theoretical analysis finally being translated into operational procedures. The other pilots leaned forward in their chairs, studying the unconventional flight patterns with the intensity of professionals who understood they were witnessing something revolutionary. The key principle, Kim explained, pointing to the formation diagrams, is unpredictability without chaos. We maintain tactical cohesion while eliminating the geometric patterns that allow adversaries to predict our positioning. Lieutenant Commander Young raised her hand. How do we maintain mutual support if we're not in standard formation? Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Dynamic positioning based on threat vectors rather than fixed geometric relationships. Each aircraft adjusts its position relative to the others, based on the tactical situation, not predetermined patterns. The concept challenged fundamental assumptions about air combat formation flying that had guided naval aviation for decades. Traditional formations prioritized predictable relationships between aircraft to ensure reliable communication and mutual support. Sarah's approach sacrificed predictability for tactical flexibility. Lieutenant Chun called out Lieutenant Rodriguez from his position near the back of the room. What happens if we lose sight of each other during maneuvering? Standard formations provide visual reference points. Situational awareness becomes more important than visual confirmation, Sarah replied. Each pilot maintains a tactical picture through sensors and communication, rather than relying on visual formation keeping. It requires higher skill levels, but provides tactical advantages that outweigh the increased complexity. Commander Thompson entered the briefing room as Sarah finished her explanation, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the assembled pilots and their unconventional tactical charts. His presence created immediate tension, given his vocal opposition to deviation from established doctrine. Lieutenant Commander Kim, Thompson said formally, I understand you're planning to test experimental tactics during today's exercise. Yes, sir, Kim replied, standing at attention. Captain Morrison approved operational testing of Lieutenant Chun's tactical analysis. Thompson's eyes moved to Sarah, studying her with the careful attention of someone reassessing a previous judgment. Lieutenant Chun, yesterday you were under arrest for insubordination. Today you're briefing tactical procedures to experienced combat pilots. That's quite a change in status. Sir, the situation evolved based on operational requirements, Sarah replied carefully. Indeed it did, Thompson observed. And if your experimental tactics fail against the adversaries, you understand the consequences. Yes, sir. Court-martial for providing false tactical intelligence. Thompson nodded slowly. Then you're betting your career on theoretical analysis, developed through unauthorized observation. Sir, I'm betting my career on mathematical principles that don't change based on authorization status. The response drew appreciative murmurs from several pilots who recognized the fundamental truth behind Sarah's words. Tactical principles existed independently of institutional approval, and effectiveness mattered more than official sanction. Very well, Thompson said after a long pause. Today's exercise will test whether innovation can overcome experience. I hope for everyone's sake that your confidence is justified. 1 hour later, Sarah found herself strapping into an FA-18 Super Hornet for the first time in 4 months. The aircraft was newer and more advanced than her usual ride, with updated avionics and enhanced sensor capabilities that would be crucial for executing the complex tactics she had developed. "Lieutenant," Commander Kim's voice crackled through her headset as they completed their pre-flight checks. "Dragonflight, radio check." "Dragon 2, up," Sarah replied, using her assigned call sign for the first time since arriving aboard Constellation. "Dragon 3, up," responded Lieutenant Morrison, who had volunteered to fly despite his previous skepticism about unconventional tactics. "Dragon 4, up," came the voice of Lieutenant Commander Young, completing the four-ship formation that would test Sarah's theories against proven adversaries. As they taxied toward the catapults, Sarah reviewed her tactical notes one final time. Everything she had observed and analyzed over the past 4 months was about to face the ultimate test, against opponents who had never been defeated using conventional approaches. The catapult launch felt different this time, carrying her not just into the Pacific sky, but into the most important engagement of her naval career. As Dragonflight climbed toward their assigned altitude, Sarah activated her sensor systems and began implementing the tactical procedures she had developed through months of patient observation. "Dragonflight, contact bearing 320, range 45 miles. Kim announced as the adversary aircraft appeared on their tactical displays. 6 bandits in loose formation, approaching from the northwest. Through her sensors, Sarah could see Commander Harrison leading the Top Gun formation with the same confident approach that had dominated previous exercises. But today would be different. Today they would face tactics they had never encountered before. "Dragonflight, execute asymmetric 1, Kim ordered, initiating the formation change that Sarah had designed specifically to counter distributed engagement techniques. The 4 Super Hornets spread across a wide front, but not in the predictable line abreast formation that adversaries could exploit. Instead, they positioned themselves at irregular intervals and altitudes, creating a tactical array that appeared random, but was actually based on precise mathematical calculations. "Contact, multiple bandits spreading to multiple vectors," Morrison reported from his position on the southern flank. "They're beginning the distributed engagement approach." Sarah watched through her sensors as the Top Gun pilots attempted to execute their proven tactics against Dragonflight's unconventional positioning. For the first time in months, the adversaries found themselves unable to achieve coordinated positioning because their opponents weren't presenting predictable targets. "Dragon 2 has contact bearing 285, Sarah announced, identifying Commander Harrison's aircraft through thermal signature analysis. "He's attempting to isolate Dragon Leader using standard displacement techniques." "Roger, Dragon 2, Kim replied. "Execute countermaneuver Alpha." The countermaneuver was Sarah's specific response to the isolation tactics that had defeated so many previous formations. "Instead of maintaining POSI, that's because we're not giving them the tactical references they need," Sarah explained over the tactical frequency. "Their techniques require predictable opponent positioning. Without it, they can't achieve coordination." Through her targeting pod, Sarah watched as the Top Gun pilots found themselves facing an unprecedented tactical situation. Their distributed engagement techniques required opponents who maneuvered according to established patterns. Dragonflight's asymmetric positioning denied them the predictable references they needed to execute coordinated attacks. "Dragonflight, I'm seeing adversary formation integrity beginning to break down," Young reported from her position on the northern flank. "They're reverting to Inshin relative to his wingman." Kim adjusted his position relative to the threat, preventing Harrison from achieving the tactical advantage that distributed engagement techniques required. "Unknown aircraft, this is adversary leader." Harrison's voice came through the tactical frequency with surprise clearly audible. "You're using non-standard formation procedures. Identify your tactical approach." "Adversary leader, this is Dragon." "Leader, Kim replied with confidence that had been absent from previous exercises. "We're using naval aviation tactics, nothing more, nothing less." But Sarah knew they were using something far more sophisticated than standard procedures. Her asymmetric formation techniques were based on mathematical principles that turned the adversary's own tactical innovations against them. "That's because we're not giving them the tactical references they need," Sarah explained over the tactical frequency. "Their techniques require predictable opponent positioning. Without it, they can't achieve coordination." Through her targeting pod, Sarah watched as the Top Gun pilots found themselves facing an unprecedented tactical situation. Their distributed engagement techniques required opponents who maneuvered according to established patterns. Dragonflight's asymmetric positioning denied them the predictable references they needed to execute coordinated attacks. "Dragonflight, I'm seeing adversary formation integrity beginning to break down," Young reported from her position on the northern flank. "They're reverting to individual engagement tactics." The observation confirmed Sarah's theoretical analysis. When denied the tactical advantages that distributed engagement provided, even highly skilled pilots would revert to conventional approaches that could be countered using superior numbers and technology. "Dragon 2, you have a clear shot on adversary 3, Kim announced as the tactical situation developed according to Sarah's predictions. Fox 3, Sarah called, launching simulated missiles against Lieutenant Commander Walsh's aircraft. But unlike previous exercises, her targeting solution was based on actual adversary position rather than false signatures or decoy presentations. "Good. Hit Dragon 2, the exercise controller announced. Adversary 3 is declared destroyed." For the first time in months, an American pilot had achieved a successful engagement against the Top Gun adversaries. The victory represented more than individual success. It validated the principle that tactical innovation could overcome established superiority. "Multiple adversaries converging on Dragon Leader," Morrison announced as the remaining Top Gun pilots attempted to regain tactical initiative through concentrated assault. "Dragonflight, execute asymmetric 2, Kim ordered, initiating the defensive maneuver that Sarah had designed specifically for this tactical situation. The 4 Super Hornets spread across multiple altitudes and vectors while maintaining coordinated defensive coverage. The maneuver appeared chaotic to external observers, but each aircraft was positioned according to precise calculations that maximized defensive capability while maintaining offensive options. "Dragon 4, Fox 3 on Adversary 5, Young announced, as the tactical geometry provided her with clear targeting opportunities. "Dragon 3, Fox 3 on Adversary 2, Morrison added, his confidence growing as Sarah's tactics proved their effectiveness against world-class opponents. Within 8 minutes of initial contact, Dragonflight had achieved 3 confirmed kills against adversaries who had previously seemed invincible. The Top Gun pilots found themselves facing systematic defeat for the first time in recent memory. "Adversary Leader, this is Dragon Leader," Kim announced as the engagement approached its conclusion. "Request permission to demonstrate advanced tactical maneuver." "Dragon Leader, permission granted," Harrison replied, his professional curiosity clearly overriding competitive considerations. "Dragonflight, execute asymmetric 3, Kim ordered. Sarah smiled inside her oxygen mask as the formation implemented her most sophisticated tactical innovation. The 4 Super Hornets converged on the remaining adversary aircraft, using coordinated maneuvering that combined individual excellence with mathematical precision. The maneuver was her masterpiece, developed through months of studying how individual skill could be multiplied through coordinated application. Each pilot maintained individual tactical capability while contributing to formation effectiveness that exceeded the sum of its parts. "Outstanding tactical execution." Harrison's voice carried genuine admiration as Dragonflight achieved perfect positioning around his remaining aircraft. "I've never seen coordination like that." "Thank you, Adversary Leader," Kim replied. "We had an excellent tactical consultant." As the exercise concluded with Dragonflight having achieved complete tactical victory, Sarah realized that everything had changed. Her months of patient observation and theoretical analysis had produced practical results that validated the principle that innovation could emerge from unexpected sources. "Dragonflight, return to base," came the order from the exercise controller. Outstanding performance by all participants. During the flight back to USS Constellation, Sarah reflected on the magnitude of what had occurred. In 45 minutes, her tactical theories had proven their effectiveness against opponents who had seemed invincible using conventional approaches. But more importantly, she had demonstrated that excellence could emerge from observation, that innovation could challenge established doctrine, and that sometimes the most important victories belong to people who refuse to accept limitations others tried to place on them. The recognition and vindication were complete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today had proven that patient observation and mathematical analysis could triumph over experience and establish superiority when, applied with courage and precision, the observer had become the innovator. And naval aviation would never be quite the same. The Admiral's conference room aboard USS Constellation had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. 3 days after Dragonflight's historic victory over the Top Gun adversaries, the ship's senior leadership gathered to address implications that extended far beyond a single training exercise. The polished mahogany table reflected the overhead. Lights as charts, tactical analyses, and official reports spread across its surface told the story of institutional transformation. Admiral Hartley sat at the head of the table, his weathered face bearing an expression that combined professional satisfaction with personal reflection. To his right, Captain Morrison reviewed Sarah's comprehensive tactical analysis, while Commander Thompson studied the exercise data with the careful attention of someone whose fundamental assumptions had been challenged and proven inadequate. "Gentlemen," Admiral Hartley began, "we're here to discuss the most significant tactical development in naval aviation since the introduction of beyond visual range missiles. Lieutenant Chun's innovations have proven that individual observation and analysis can produce results that our established institutional processes failed to achieve." Sarah sat at the far end of the table, her service uniform bearing the same plain appearance that had marked her as an outsider for months, but the Kindeep Warzavis uniform bearing the same plain appearance that had marked her as an outsider for months. Atmosphere surrounding her had changed completely. Instead of dismissive glances and patronizing comments, she found herself the focus of intense professional interest from officers who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Lieutenant Chun," Admiral Hartley continued, "your tactical analysis has been reviewed by the Naval War College, the Center for Naval Analyses, and the Office of Naval Intelligence. All 3 institutions have concluded that your asymmetric formation techniques represent a fundamental advancement in air-to-air combat doctrine. The validation from the Navy's most prestigious analytical institutions represented more than professional recognition. It confirmed that innovation could emerge from sources the bureaucratic system never expected, challenging institutional prejudices about where tactical knowledge should originate." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The techniques worked because they addressed mathematical principles rather than conventional assumptions. Commander Thompson shifted in his seat, his expression revealing the discomfort of someone whose professional judgment had been publicly contradicted by events. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology. My resistance to your tactical input reflected institutional bias rather than sound professional judgment." The admission carried significant weight, coming from an officer whose career had been built on tactical expertise and command authority. Thompson's acknowledgement that institutional bias had prevented recognition of valuable intelligence represented a rare moment of bureaucratic honesty. "Sir, institutional resistance to unvetted innovation serves Important purposes, Sarah replied diplomatically. The challenge is distinguishing between necessary caution and counterproductive rigidity. Captain Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. Lieutenant Chun, the question before us now is how to institutionalize the tactical innovations you've developed while maintaining the disciplinary standards that ensure operational effectiveness. The challenge was profound. Sarah's success had emerged specifically because she operated outside institutional constraints that limited conventional tactical development, incorporating her methods into official doctrine without destroying their innovative character would require careful balance between recognition and bureaucratization. Sir, I believe the solution lies in expanding the definition of qualified tactical analysis, Sarah suggested. Innovation should be evaluated based on effectiveness rather than the institutional position of its source. Admiral Hartley nodded approvingly. That principle will guide the organizational changes we're implementing. Effective immediately, Lieutenant Chun, you're being assigned as the strike group's first tactical innovation officer, reporting directly to Captain Morrison. The new position represented something unprecedented in naval aviation. Rather than forcing Sarah to conform to existing bureaucratic structures, the Navy was creating institutional space for the kind of independent analysis that had produced her breakthrough insights. Your responsibilities will include continuous evaluation of adversary techniques, development of countermeasures, and training qualified pilots in advanced tactical procedures, Captain Morrison explained. You'll have direct access to all exercise data and authority to implement experimental tactics for operational testing. The scope of the assignment exceeded anything Sarah had imagined during her months of silent observation. She would transition from dismissed observer to institutional innovator with resources and authority to pursue tactical development on an unprecedented scale. Additionally, Admiral Hartley continued, your asymmetric formation techniques are being incorporated into the Navy's advanced tactical training curriculum. The Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center has requested your assistance in developing standardized procedures based on your innovations. The institutionalization of her tactics represented validation of the highest order. Military organizations rarely acknowledged that established doctrine required fundamental revision, particularly based on innovations developed by junior officers. Operating outside official channels, Lieutenant Commander Kim entered the conference room as the Admiral finished speaking, carrying a folder thick with documents and bearing an expression of barely contained excitement. Sir, I have the initial results from Strike Fighter Squadron 97's implementation of Lieutenant Chun's tactics, Kim announced. They achieved a 93% success rate against adversary pilots who had previously maintained tactical superiority. The results confirmed that Sarah's innovations possessed broader applicability than even she had anticipated. Multiple squadrons implementing her techniques were achieving systematic victories against opponents who had dominated conventional tactics for months. Outstanding, Admiral Hartley replied. Lieutenant Commander Kim, you'll be working with Lieutenant Chun to establish training protocols for fleet-wide implementation of these techniques. As the meeting continued, Sarah found herself at the center of discussions about institutional change that would affect naval aviation training for years to come. Her transition from passive observer to active innovator was becoming permanent, with resources and authority to pursue tactical development that could influence the future of air combat. But the most significant transformation wasn't organizational or professional. It was personal. Commander Harrison entered the conference room as the formal portion of the meeting concluded, his Top Gun instructor credentials carrying weight that transcended rank considerations. His presence represented acknowledgement from the adversary community that Sarah's innovations had fundamentally altered the tactical landscape. Lieutenant Chun, Harrison said, extending his hand with genuine respect, I've been flying adversary missions for 8 years, and your tactics represent the most significant challenge we've faced. You've forced us to completely reevaluate our approach to distributed engagement." The admission from one of naval aviation's most respected pilots carried implications that extended beyond personal recognition. Sarah's innovations had proven capable of challenging tactical supremacy that had seemed unassailable, forcing even the most skilled opponents to acknowledge the need for fundamental revision of their own methods. "Commander Harrison, your techniques pushed conventional tactics to their limits," Sarah replied. "Understanding where those limits existed was essential for developing effective countermeasures." "That's exactly the point," Harrison observed. "You succeeded because you studied our methods more carefully than we studied our own limitations. That kind of analytical depth is rare in any community." Lieutenant Commander Walsh joined the conversation, her expression reflecting professional curiosity rather than competitive disappointment. "Lieutenant Chun, how did you maintain analytical objectivity while being systematically excluded from the tactical community?" The question addressed the psychological challenge that had defined Sarah's experience aboard Constellation. Maintaining professional dedication while facing institutional dismissal required personal strength that extended beyond technical competence. "I focused on the work rather than the recognition," Sarah replied. "The tactical principles existed regardless of whether anyone acknowledged my analysis. Understanding them correctly mattered more than receiving credit for the understanding. That perspective enabled you to develop insights that wouldn't have emerged from conventional institutional processes." Walsh observed. "Official tactical development often reflects institutional assumptions rather than objective analysis." The conversation was interrupted by Master Chief Santos, who entered the conference room with an expression of professional satisfaction and personal pride. "Begging the Admiral's pardon," Santos said, "but the crew wanted Lieutenant Chen to know that her success represents something important to everyone aboard this ship. Watching excellence emerge from unexpected sources reminds us that innovation can come from anywhere." The Master Chief's words reflected broader institutional implications of Sarah's transformation. Her success challenged hierarchical assumptions about where valuable contributions should originate, inspiring others who might possess insights that conventional systems wouldn't recognize or value. "Master Chief," Admiral Hartley replied, "you're absolutely correct. Lieutenant Chun's achievement represents more than tactical innovation. It demonstrates the importance of recognizing excellence regardless of its source." As the meeting dispersed, Sarah found herself surrounded by officers who sought to understand the analytical methods that had produced such unprecedented results. For the first time since arriving aboard Constellation, she was valued not just for her compliance with institutional expectations, but for her unique perspective on tactical challenges. Walking through the carrier's corridors toward her new office space, Sarah reflected on the magnitude of transformation that had occurred in less than a week. She had evolved from dismissed observer to institutional innovator, from passive data collector to active tactical developer, from silent outsider to recognized expert. But the most important change was personal. She had proven to herself that persistence in the face of institutional resistance could produce results that validated individual conviction against bureaucratic prejudice. Her months of patient observation and careful analysis had culminated in recognition that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. The phone in her new office was already ringing when she arrived, with requests for tactical consultation from squadrons throughout the Pacific Fleet. Her innovations were spreading through the naval aviation community with the speed that characterized truly valuable developments. As she answered the first call and began explaining asymmetric formation principles to pilots she had never met, Sarah realized that her transformation was complete. The observer had become the teacher, the outsider had become the expert, and the dismissed junior officer had become an institutional innovator whose work would influence naval aviation for years to come. More importantly, She had demonstrated that excellence possessed no prerequisites except dedication, analytical rigor, and the courage to challenge assumptions that others accepted without question. Her success proved that innovation could emerge from any source willing to pursue understanding with sufficient patience and precision. The transformation was permanent, irreversible, and inspirational. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply tactical innovation to operational problems, and new chances to prove that individual excellence could transcend institutional limitations. But today represented something more precious than professional success. It represented the validation of a principle that extended far beyond military service, that observers could become leaders, that outsiders could become experts, and that sometimes the most important battles were won not by following established procedures, but by having the courage to challenge them when they proved inadequate. The silent observer had found her voice, and naval aviation would never be quite the same. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.